Alrighty guys, welcome back. So what we have here is my dream rig. It is a 2011 6.7 liter F350 with a Northern Lite 811 Queen Classic. Alright, across the last 5 months of traveling full time in this thing for work, skiing, shooting, I've been working at all of the different pros and cons and writing them down so that I can present them to you and help you avoid any of the mistakes that I've made along the way. While we cover them, I'm going to be presenting all of the solutions that I've either tried or found for these problems so that you can fix them along the way. And then at the very end, I'm going to be covering a couple of the changes that I have planned to make this rig twice as capable. Let's get into it. Alright, so getting right into it, the first mistake that you can easily avoid right at the buying stage is buying a rig and vehicle that are capable of handling the temperatures and environments that you're going to be in. Alright, we tried to address this by buying a Northern Lite, which is supposedly one of the best four-season campers. However, right away when we hit negative 15 degrees, we started to have serious issues with our water lines freezing. And that's because this rig just wasn't as well equipped as we initially thought. And let me show you why that is. All right, so we are here at the back of the rig now, and this is kind of the central point where all of my water lines come together. I have all of my low point valves as well as my water pump and my dump valves. So this is kind of the point that's most likely to freeze and break my entire system. But as you can see, it's kind of in an isolated section of the camper by itself where it's away from all of my heat and unprotected from the surrounding environment. Additionally, you can see that this door has very little insulation and the surrounding walls of this compartment are barely insulated at all. So while this is supposed to be a four-season camper, the way that this is laid out and designed makes it very easy for my primary water lines to freeze when it gets into those colder temperatures. So while I did my research, because this was my first time buying something like this, I kind of took it at face value that this was going to be a four-season camper without actually looking at the features that would make it a four-season camper and realizing that this setup right here wasn't going to cut it when it got into the sub-zero temperatures. So my biggest advice to you to avoid dealing with freezing or any other climate-related issues is buy a camper that fits the environments that you're going to be in. And it doesn't just have to be cold-related. If you're going to be in some place like the Pacific Northwest where you deal with high humidity and lots of moisture, make sure you're buying a rig that is better equipped to get that humidity out, preventing mold and deterioration inside, and is also better equipped for the rain and isn't going to have water pooling on the roof or getting into places where it's more likely to rust or break down wood. Water is going to be the bane of your existence with a rig like this. It can destroy the layers of the walls, it can cause wood to rot out, and it can cause basically anything to rust. So you need to pay attention to make sure that your rig is capable of handling the environments that you're going to go into. Now, talking about solutions. The easiest way to get this right is to buy a rig that's equipped. Now, as you can see, this would not be an easy thing to renovate. To move this setup would require me to renovate the entire camper. So I've had to implement some stopgap solutions such as hot water bottles and little heat packs to get through some of the coldest nights, as well as just knowing what it's going to take to thaw out the lines afterwards. If you end up in this situation and you want to implement a more permanent solution, one thing you could do is to condense down the setup in here or shrink it essentially by moving the lines and then implement more padding around, as well as moving a heating line that pushes hot air from your heater into this compartment to keep it better heated. There is one that's factory with this camper, but it's not very effective. So if I want this to stay warm year round, I'm gonna have to extend that line and put in a secondary fan to push more hot air into here. Now later on, I'm going to talk about some heating solutions and they could potentially be a solution to this, but let's get into the next point. Propane, that means our gas stove, our oven, our fridge, our freezer, and our heat are all running off propane. And during the summer, spring, and fall months, that's not really an issue because when it's only running the fridge, freezer, and the stove, it's relatively efficient. And the 2 tanks that are in here will last you almost an entire month. However, the second it became winter and we were running that heat almost non-stop to prevent the lines from freezing, all of a sudden we were going through 3 tanks every 10 days. And aside from the inconvenience of constantly monitoring and switching tanks throughout the day, there is the massive cost of going through that much propane and having to drive to a gas station every week to get all new propane tanks. All right, I'm going to show you guys the process of actually swapping out a tank real fast so you can see what you'd have to go through. But first, as you can see, just to make it even worse, I have to stand on another propane tank or stool just to be able to actually reach the propane tanks, which on uneven terrain or in the rain just makes this whole process a lot less pleasant. So getting into the actual process of how we do this, right here are my 2 propane tanks. And in order to swap them out, let's say I was just swapping one, I have a bracket here and a hose here. First, I'm going to make sure it's tight. Take off my hose, release the bracket. Pull that guy out. These are pretty dang heavy when they're full. Second one goes up. Got to get this right. All these propane tanks are slightly different sizes, so they don't tend to sit nicely. Screw that in. Tighten this guy down. And done. All right, so obviously I was able to do that pretty quick, but at this point I've also done it way too many times. And when you have to do this in the freezing cold or pouring rain, it starts to become a massive inconvenience. But beyond that, the cost of swapping out 3 propane tanks every single week in winter also starts to add up massively. So if you are only going to be using this rig in the spring, summer, and fall, this isn't nearly as much of a concern. But if you're somebody who has a rig like this specifically for winter travel, then it's becoming enough of an issue that I am considering other solutions. All right, the only real solution that you would have to this specific problem would be to essentially run a diesel or gas heater the same way that almost any Sprinter van does. In order to do that on this rig, I would need to tap the diesel tank from the truck, run a line up into the camper, and then install a diesel heater somewhere in the camper that powers off of my 12-volt power supply. And then if I wanted to still be able to take the camper off of the truck, I would need to put a quick disconnect into that hose to allow me to disconnect it whenever I'm taking it off. That is a ton of work, but the alternative isn't great either. Once again, this is kind of an issue that is very specific to a specific use case, but in my case, it became a massive headache, a massive problem, and was one of my largest expenses throughout the winter. So be aware of it. So the next major issue that I'm going to talk about is kind of a combination of the previous two and the first one that you're really going to worry about even if you're not doing any winter camping whatsoever, and that's going to be condensation, all right? Condensation management is something that you're going to see widely talked about in both the van life, truck camper, and RV communities. And that is because if you look around in here, everything is made of either wood, wallpaper, soft materials, fabric, and water will destroy all of this, all right? Water pooling up in spaces that you don't want it to will very quickly deteriorate and destroy these rigs, all right? Managing condensation in a space this tight can be extremely difficult, all right? That's all I really need to say about condensation, so let's get into some solutions that you can use to deal with it. The first one on the most basic level is common sense, all right? Whenever you're running water, hot water, or you have multiple people in here, crack a window, all right? Every single night, crack some sort of window. All of these windows have mesh on them, so you don't have to worry about bugs. We have two-way fans both here and in the bathroom. They should always be running if you're taking a shower, and they should always be cracked if you're parked so that you're letting out all of that humidity from your breath, all right? Step 2. Get some super compact dehumidifiers, all right? This mini dehumidifier is excellent. We just hang it in the kitchen. It soaks up humidity. Once it's wet, it lets us know on the front. All we have to do is plug it in and it heats itself up, dries itself out, and is ready to go again, all right? Lastly, the biggest place that you're going to deal with humidity issues is going to be underneath the bed. Okay, underneath the bed, can get so bad that we actually had full-on pools of water and sheets of ice underneath our bed in the winter, okay? And we had a previous anti-condensation material down, but it just wasn't doing enough. And even with multiple towels, we still were not able to soak it all up. That's how much water had collected underneath this bed. All right, the solution that I found to work the best is this Frawley sleep system. I did a ton of research into different forums and stuff. Everybody said this would work, this would work. Some people said just Reflectix would work, and I knew for a fact that that wasn't true. We got the Frawley sleep system. It was a bit expensive, but it has completely solved our condensation issues. Every single morning for the first week that we had it, I would pull this up and check for condensation in the center of the bed, and we never had any. So this allows significantly more airflow to pass through underneath the bed, allowing that space to heat up as well and preventing the temperature gradient that would allow condensation to form. So if you're going to be getting a rig, if you're going to be getting a van, anticipate this problem ahead of time. Take the steps to prevent it so that you don't have to deal with the consequences of not doing so. Moving away from rig features and into more general ideas and problems that you're going to run into with this type of rig, or even just going with something like this, is the overall size and commitment, as well as what that's going to end up costing you. Okay, so it's easy to look at the initial prices of these things and not calculate in the long-term upkeep and stuff, but especially with a vehicle like this that's a 1-ton diesel, you're going to have to factor in significantly higher maintenance costs, and once mechanics know that you're living on the rig, everything goes through the roof. Things cost so much more than you're going to expect just in routine maintenance, as well as the additional maintenance that you have to do to either support the weight capabilities in case of a truck camper or the towing capabilities. It's really simple stuff, but stuff like my oil changes on this cost 3 to 4 times as much as any other vehicle that I have. I'm going through a lot more wear and tear on my hub assemblies and my axle assemblies. I have to make sure all the fluids are done on them regularly because of the additional weight. Okay, so the cost for maintenance on this is so much higher than any other vehicle that I own, as well as just the day-to-day impact of driving it. It is really, really difficult and frustrating to both drive this rig in a city, but also find a place to park this thing in a city. Almost all city parking nowadays is in parking garages, and we are currently 11.5 feet tall, meaning we are not fitting in any parking garages whatsoever. And there have been some days when I'm picking up somebody from the airport or something like that, where it has taken me almost an hour to find anywhere to park. So there is just the overall impact of having a significantly larger rig, and for some people, that's a complete deal breaker. With a lot of vans, you can get pretty compact and discreet, as well as low impact. They get much better gas mileage, and some of them are, very, very subtle. You can park someplace and not be noticed. They can fit into the normal footprint of a normal vehicle. This thing does not. We are 24 feet long, 8 feet wide, 11 feet tall, and we weigh 12,000 pounds. I have to worry about our gross vehicle weight rating, how big parking spots are, how long parking spots are, and I've been kicked out of parking lots just for being too big to fit into a single spot. So be aware of the size and impact that this vehicle is actually going to have, as well as the cost of maintaining something this big and expensive. Alrighty guys, so this final point here is kind of the most broad, but it's also the one that I would pay attention to the most. And it's kind of in many ways a summary of all of the other points that I've talked about so far. And that is the number of failure points on the rig. All right, this has been incredibly frustrating. And by failure points, what I'm talking about is any point where a small failure could cause serious damage to the rig. For example, all of these panels here have been heavily caulked in, but if that caulk and seal was to fail and any moisture was to get inside of there, it could split up the fiberglass layers, rot out the wood, and rust out any screws holding that entire panel together. And that type of failure is so detrimental. It costs a ton of money to fix. It often requires dismantling significant parts of the rig, and all it takes is just a little crack in this, or a crack in the fiberglass, or a little hole or someplace where you forgot a seal. So on the outside of this, you can see there are a ton of different panels, and every single one of them presents a failure point. But there's also failure points that you might not think about. For example, where the two pieces of the shell come together. In the case of most metal framed campers, like Lance campers, anywhere where that L-beam frame connects to a panel is a potential failure point where moisture could get through. All right. Another one that most people don't think about is these tie-down points, all right? This has by far been the most frustrating part of this camper so far because we've had two of these fail where the caulk seal got torn out from too much or too little tension on this. Water got up in there and rotted out a massive panel. And that required me to remove large sections of the camper, either internally or externally, to go in and replace that wood panel just because a little bit of caulk wasn't sealed properly. All right. This is incredibly frustrating. So if I was building my own rig or buying another rig, one of the biggest things I would look for right off the bat is how many failure points are there and how routine of maintenance do they require. Our routine maintenance for this looks like every couple years going back through and replacing all the caulk, and every single year going through and cleaning and fully waxing the outside of this camper to preserve the integrity of the fiberglass and the gel coat that is on the outside of it. All right, so this last point to drive home, the more failure points you have on your rig, the more potential for something tiny that you don't notice to cause significant damage, costing you thousands of dollars or hundreds of hours in repairs. And that is incredibly frustrating. Look for that when buying, and I promise you, you'll save yourself a ton of trouble. So let's get into some of the things that I'm going to be updating on this rig to make it way more capable in the future. All right, guys, and so with that, those are the 5 biggest cons that I've run into on this vehicle. That's going to be freezing and cold weather protection, propane consumption, condensation buildup, size and price, and then overall points of failure and regular maintenance intervals. All right, now, that is not to say that this is not still my dream rig, all right? I love this thing, all right? I have made some of my best memories out in the middle of nowhere while it's snowing outside, being warm and comfortable inside, and then going backcountry skiing in the morning, all right? This has taken me so many places and I love it so much. It truly is my dream rig, but I wanted to address these concerns so that anybody who is looking at getting a setup like this can kind of prepare for them or preemptively address them when buying their rig so that they avoid some of the mistakes that I made. All right. Lastly, I promised I'd go over a couple of the changes that I'm going to be making to this vehicle to make it twice as capable in the future. So let's talk about that. Starting right off at the front, I'm going to be swapping out the stock bumper here with a higher clearance bumper with a full ranch hand. Now, most of that is protection, cosmetic, and approach angle, but the thing that I'm really excited about with that is getting a front receiver hitch, all right? With this rig, you're putting everything that you want to do into one vehicle, right? Having that front receiver hitch is going to give me the option to put a bike rack or dirt bike rack on the front, allowing me more options in what I take out. Could also allow storage or anything else up on the front. More versatility is better in my opinion, and relatively compared to the rest of the things that we're going to talk about, this is a pretty low commitment option. All right, moving deeper into the vehicle, next one is a suspension build. All right, for me, I've been looking at the Carli suspension. Unfortunately, this is definitely the most expensive thing that I could do to this truck. And the biggest reason for that is right now, while this thing is incredibly capable off-road, it is incredibly unpleasant off-road. So by putting in a Carli suspension build that is better equipped to handle the weight of this vehicle and better capable at balancing the top-heavy nature of this rig, it's going to ride significantly better. So that's one that I'm planning out, but it's just a huge monetary commitment, so I'm waiting until I have the funding to do so. All right, going deeper onto the rig, currently I'm running the stock pickup bed on this vehicle, but down the line, I'd really like to swap it over to a custom flatbed. And the reason that I'm going to do that is because right now there's a lot of awkward spacing in fitting a truck camper that is generically fit onto a truck bed, okay? There's these odd gaps right here. There's really tight spots where it can bang up here, all right? By getting a custom flatbed built that essentially hugs the camper tighter and puts in compartments along here, I'm going to significantly increase my storage while better protecting the camper and I can move these tie down points onto that flatbed, getting them out of the way and allowing it a little bit better geometry to support these. All right, now I plan to do that one completely custom built, weld all that myself, but it's gonna be a flatbed that sits on the frame, and then we're gonna have essentially storage compartments that come all the way up to here. All right, pretty big build, lower commitment monetary wise, but the benefits of having that extra storage and protecting the camper better in the long run seem worth it to me. And then lastly, I can't really show you this one. I talked about it earlier, but tapping the diesel tank on the truck and then running a diesel line to a diesel heater inside of the camper, for me personally, is going to be a change that has to happen eventually. And the biggest reason for that is by putting in my own diesel heater in there, I can locate it closer to the water low points and allow more heat to get into that compartment, keeping it warm, preventing freezing, and reducing how often I have to swap out my propane tanks, allowing me to go longer in the backcountry without swapping these out regularly and saving the money on propane. So those are kind of the 4 big changes that I'm going to be making in the future. I've spent a ton of time doing research into what options I want to go for and why I want to do each thing. It's not just kind of a copy and paste formula. After spending so much time living in this thing full time, I've been really dialing out what works and doesn't work. And it's going to be an ongoing project for the next couple of years to get this thing perfect where it can literally go anywhere and do anything. Now guys, if you learned anything today, if you enjoy this type of content, we talk a lot about backcountry travel, photography, filmmaking, overlanding, backcountry skiing on this channel, a lot of technical stuff. We do a lot of prep for each of these videos, kind of going into all the different subjects that we want to cover. So don't forget to like, subscribe. We're going to be making tons more videos like this. Our next big project is actually going to be in Africa. So if you want to see what that's all about, we'll see you guys next time.